When a ruthless mafia boss kicks Henry Cavill out of his VIP seat on a train, he has no idea he's just challenged Superman. Tension builds, the carriage turns into a battleground, and an explosive fight is about to shake everything to its core. The metallic hum of the train echoed like a slow heartbeat as Henry Cavill sat quietly in the VIP section, his broad shoulders barely fitting in the narrow seat, his eyes staring out the window at the blur of city lights whipping past in the darkness, his mind far away from the noise of the world. Until the sharp click of expensive shoes and the overpowering stench of arrogance broke the calm, drawing him back to reality. A man with a face tattoo like a serpent and a smug grin plastered across his jaw strutted down the aisle like he owned the whole carriage, flanked by two equally menacing enforcers in tailored suits, their bulging jackets betraying the outlines of concealed weapons. And in a voice dripping with venom, the tattooed man jabbed a finger toward Henry, barking, "That's my seat." Henry didn't move at first, just turned his head slightly, calm, almost too calm, his deep voice steady as he said, "This is a public train. Find another seat." The air went cold, the two henchmen exchanging glances as their boss smirked, taking a step closer until he was almost nose to nose with Henry, his gold watch glinting under the fluorescent lights, his tattoo twisting like a coiled snake across his cheek as he hissed, "Do you know who I am?" Henry's jaw tightened, a flicker of steel in his eyes, his voice dropping lower as he replied, "Do you know who you're talking to?" That single sentence seemed to set something off. The men around them chuckled darkly, one of them cracking his knuckles, the other casually blocking the aisle to prevent anyone from passing through, the entire carriage suddenly feeling smaller, tenser, like a cage. And the passengers who had been quietly scrolling on their phones or dozing off began to sense the storm about to break, whispering nervously and trying to look away. The mafia boss leaned in, his breath hot, his finger now poking Henry in the chest, and sneered, "Get up, now!" For a moment, Henry simply breathed, slow and measured, the rumble of the train masking the almost imperceptible shift in his posture, his muscles coiling like steel cables under his shirt. Then, as if time itself decided to hold its breath, Henry stood up. Not quickly, not aggressively, just with the kind of quiet authority that made the air thicken. And suddenly, the tattooed man's smirk faltered, because standing face to face with Henry Cavill was like staring at a mountain that had decided to move. "Last chance," Henry said, his voice a low growl now, not angry, not shouting, just final. The boss laughed it off, masking his sudden unease with bravado, waving his hand and signaling his men, "Throw him out!" That was the moment the world snapped. The first henchman lunged forward, his fist swinging, but Henry moved faster. Not fast enough to reveal what he truly was, but fast enough to make it clear he was no ordinary man. Catching the punch mid-air with one hand, the sound of bone and sinew straining under his grip, filling the carriage like the crack of thunder. And with a simple twist of his wrist, Henry sent the man sprawling into the row of seats, metal clanging and passengers screaming as the impact rattled the carriage. The second thug reached under his jacket, pulling out a knife, but Henry had already stepped forward, one massive hand grabbing the man's wrist and squeezing until the blade clattered harmlessly to the floor. Then, with a single motion, he shoved him back so hard the man crashed into the automatic doors, leaving a dent. The mafia boss was no longer smiling, his cocky swagger replaced with a flash of rage and something dangerously close to fear. But before he could bark another order, Henry took a single step closer, his presence alone enough to make the entire train feel smaller, darker, as if the very lights dimmed under the weight of his glare. "You wanted the seat, but now you've got my attention." The boss's jaw clenched, his hand twitching toward the inside of his suit where something heavy was holstered, and for one long heartbeat, both men stood perfectly still, the train rattling over the tracks like a war drum, until suddenly the boss drew, Not a gun, but a sleek, silenced pistol that gleamed under the cold train lights, and the sight of it sent the passengers into chaos, screams echoing as people scrambled for cover. Henry's expression didn't change, but deep inside, the part of him that was more than human began to stir, the part that had sworn to never let innocent lives be threatened on his watch. His hands clenched into fists, not out of fear, but resolution, the tendons in his forearms standing out like steel cables, his voice a low thunder as he said, "Put it down." But the Mafia boss only grinned, lifting the gun higher, aiming it right at Henry's chest, his finger tightening on the trigger. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Henry felt the world slow, every sound stretching out, every scream fading into silence, every heartbeat pounding like a war drum until there was only the gun, the man holding it, and the unspoken promise in Henry's mind that if this man pulled the trigger, he would unleash the part of him that he kept hidden from the world. The carriage was electric now, everyone frozen, the barrel of the gun steady, the boss's smirk growing wider, his finger about to squeeze. And then, with a sound like thunderclap, the train hit a sudden jolt of turbulence that sent everyone stumbling, the boss nearly losing his footing, but recovering just enough to steady the gun again, his laughter ringing out as he shouted, "Let's see if the big man bleeds." And in that single instant before the shot rang out, Henry's eyes burned with something otherworldly, something no one in that carriage would ever forget, as he prepared to move faster than the bullet itself. And that was the moment everything changed. The world seemed to snap back into motion the very instant the trigger clicked, and the muted cough of the silencer spat fire. The bullet tore through the air like a whisper of death, and in that split second, Henry Cavill stopped holding back. His pupils flared with light, the hidden storm inside him breaking loose as he moved faster than sight, his hand snapping up to catch the bullet mid-flight with a metallic ping that echoed like a church bell through the carriage, leaving everyone frozen in disbelief as the slug sat smoking in his palm, harmless. The Mafia boss's triumphant smirk melted into something closer to terror, his arm trembling as he tried to fire again, but Henry was already there, closing the distance in a blur, his other hand wrapping around the man's wrist and bending it until the weapon clattered to the floor. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Henry growled. And before the boss could respond, Henry shoved him back against the wall so hard that the whole train shook, luggage falling from overhead racks, passengers ducking under their seats as the storm truly began. The two henchmen, bruised but not out, roared and charged at Henry from both sides, and for a moment the carriage became a whirlwind of motion, fists flying, bodies slamming into metal, the air thick with the sound of impact as Henry blocked, dodged, and struck with terrifying precision, every move calculated to disable but not kill. One thug swung a steel baton, catching Henry across the back with a crack that would have broken an ordinary man's spine. But Henry barely flinched, turning and ripping the weapon from his attacker's hands before bending it into a perfect U-shape and dropping it to the floor like a piece of trash. The other thug tried to tackle him, but Henry caught him mid-charge and hurled him down the aisle, his body skidding across the polished floor until he slammed into the sliding doors with a sickening thud, leaving a spiderweb crack in the glass. The Mafia boss used the chaos to grab his gun again, scrambling to his feet, but before he could even aim, Henry was there, his hand closing around the man's forearm with a grip like iron. "I told you to put it down," Henry said through gritted teeth, and then, with a flick of his wrist, he sent the pistol flying out the shattered window, disappearing into the night. The boss roared in rage and pulled a switchblade from his boot, slashing at Henry with surprising speed, but Henry sidestepped easily, the blade glancing harmlessly off his shirt as he caught the man by the collar and slammed him against the wall again. The passengers were no longer just terrified. They were staring in awe now, phones recording, whispers spreading like wildfire. This wasn't just some actor in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was something else, something unstoppable. The train hurtled through the night like a bullet, the fight raging on as sparks flew from broken light fixtures, alarms began to blare, and Henry finally allowed himself a moment of anger. Not uncontrolled, but focused, precise, the kind of righteous fury that burned in his chest like a second sun. "You endangered everyone on this train," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel, "and I will not let that stand." The Mafia boss spat blood on the floor and snarled, "You think this ends here? You have no idea who I am. My people will burn this whole city down before they let you walk away." Henry's expression hardened, his grip tightening just enough to make the man wince. "Then tell them," Henry said, leaning in so close the boss could see the strange glow beginning to build behind his eyes. "Superman says no." The glow flared, just for an instant, bathing the man's terrified face in crimson light. And for the first time since the fight began, the boss stopped struggling, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as he realized the truth. This wasn't a man he could intimidate. This was something far greater. But before Henry could finish what he started, a violent jolt rocked the entire train, not turbulence this time, but something far worse, as an explosion rippled from the front carriage, tearing through the night with a deafening boom. The lights went out completely, plunging the world into darkness, save for the faint red glow still shining from Henry's eyes. "What did you do?" Henry demanded, his voice echoing through the carriage like thunder, but the boss only laughed. A ragged, mad laugh that sent chills through the air. "You're too late," he hissed. "There's more than just me on this train. My men are everywhere." And then, as if to prove his words true, the sound of gunfire erupted from the next carriage, the crack of automatic rifles cutting through the night, followed by the screams of panicked passengers. Henry's head snapped toward the sound, his mind racing. There were still dozens of innocents aboard, and now they were in the crossfire. He shoved the Mafia boss down into a seat and pointed a finger at him. "Don't move," he said, his tone so sharp it was almost a commandment. And then he was gone, a blur of motion as he ripped open the door to the next carriage and stepped into chaos. The sight that greeted him froze even him for a fraction of a second. Armed men in black masks had taken the entire carriage hostage, rifles raised, shouting orders as terrified passengers cowered on the floor. And in the middle of it all, one of them spotted Henry stepping through the doorway and screamed, "There! Take him down!" The night erupted with muzzle flashes as bullets filled the air, and Henry Cavill, Superman, walked straight into the storm. The muzzle flashes turned the dark carriage into a strobe-lit nightmare as dozens of bullets screamed toward Henry, sparks flying as they tore into the walls, shattered windows, and ripped through seats. But he kept walking, calm, unstoppable, the rounds bouncing harmlessly off his chest with a sound like hail hitting steel, each ricochet sending fragments of metal skittering across the floor. The gunmen's shouts turned from rage to panic as they realized their bullets weren't working, one of them yelling, "What is he?" just before Henry reached the first attacker, grabbed the rifle in mid-burst, and crushed it in his hands like a soda can before shoving its owner backward into a row of seats so hard the frame bent in half. The others opened fire at point-blank range, but Henry was a storm now, moving with impossible speed, weaving between bullets, catching some in his hands and swatting others aside so they pinged harmlessly off the metal floor. He grabbed one gunman by the vest and hurled him across the carriage, then spun and backhanded another, sending him flying into the luggage rack overhead, which collapsed under the impact, showering sparks and debris. The passenger screamed and ducked, but Henry's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. "Stay down. I've got this." And then he was gone again, a blur moving too fast to follow, disarming one attacker after another, snapping weapons in half, sending bodies crashing into walls, windows, and each other until the air was thick with smoke and fear. One desperate soldier lobbed a flashbang, the blinding light filling the carriage with a white-hot flare, but when it cleared, Henry was still there, standing tall, eyes glowing with barely contained fury, the heat vision threatening to burst free. "You picked the wrong train," he said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. And then he charged. What followed was a symphony of destruction, fists slamming into metal, bones cracking, the screech of tearing steel as Henry ripped open a seat and used it as a shield, blocking another volley of bullets before flinging the twisted frame like a discus and knocking 3 attackers down in one strike. The last man standing pulled out a grenade, screaming, "Long live the family," as he yanks the pin, but Henry moved faster than thought, snatching the explosive from his hand and tossing it straight up through the shattered roof of the train, where it detonated harmlessly in the night sky, the flash illuminating the battlefield below. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hiss of sparking wires and the labored breathing of the defeated gunman sprawled across the floor. Henry scanned the carriage, making sure every passenger was safe, then turned his attention to the leader, a masked man still on his knees, clutching his side, his rifle broken in half at his feet. Henry crouched down, his shadow falling over the man like a judgment. "Tell me where the rest of them are," Henry demanded, his voice low, dangerous. The man spat at the floor and laughed weakly. "You think you've won? You're just at the start. This train isn't just a hit, it's bait." Henry's eyes narrowed. Bait for what? The man's smile twisted into something almost gleeful as he whispered, "For you." And then, before Henry could stop him, the man slammed a hidden detonator in his fist. Instantly, the floor shook as a second explosion tore through the back of the train, this one far stronger than the first, the shockwave ripping through the cars and sending passengers screaming as the entire vehicle lurched violently, nearly derailing. Henry's super hearing caught the sounds of metal grinding, bolts snapping. The whole train was about to tip over at full speed. He didn't hesitate. In a blur, he was at the window, ripping it open and leaping out into the rushing wind, then flying alongside the train, his cape snapping behind him as he braced himself against the side of the lead engine, straining with all his strength to keep it upright. Sparks flew from the wheels as the train skidded dangerously close to the edge of the tracks, and Henry gritted his teeth, muscles bulging as he pushed with the force of a god, slowly righting the cars one by one until the train screamed back onto the rails with a deafening screech of metal. When it was finally stable, Henry soared back into the night and re-entered the carriage through the roof, landing with a heavy thud that made the floor tremble. The masked man was gone, vanished during the chaos, leaving behind only the detonator and a spray-painted message on the wall in crude red letters, "Welcome to the war." Henry stared at the words, his jaw tightening as realization sank in. This wasn't just about a stolen VIP seat anymore. This was a declaration. The Mafia wasn't just flexing their power, they were calling him out. And deep in his chest, Henry felt the weight of what was coming next, a war he couldn't ignore. But before he could even process it, his super hearing caught something that made his blood run cold. The faint, unmistakable sound of a helicopter approaching fast, its rotors chopping through the night air and multiple heat signatures descending from it onto the roof of the train. Henry looked up, eyes glowing once more, his fists clenching as he whispered to himself, "Round 2. And then the ceiling above him buckled as new enemies dropped in through the roof, heavily armored and carrying weapons Henry had never seen before, their glowing barrels humming with deadly energy as one of them said through a mechanical voice filter, "Target acquired." The roof split open with a shriek of tearing metal as the armored mercenaries dropped into the carriage one by one, their boots slamming into the floor with the heavy, resonant thud of military-grade exoskeletons. Glowing lines running along their suits like veins of molten energy, their helmets hiding their faces behind black visors that reflected Henry's glowing eyes back at him. The passengers were frozen, too scared to move, too afraid to even breathe as the lead mercenary raised his weapon, a sleek rifle pulsing with some kind of experimental energy, and fired. The shot hit Henry square in the chest, and for the first time since the night began, he staggered backward, the blast throwing him into a row of seats that crumpled under the impact. Pain flared across his chest, not unbearable but sharp enough to make him realize these weren't normal weapons. They were designed for him. "Kryptonite charge," the leader said through the filter, his voice mechanical, cold. "Confirmed target vulnerability." Henry gritted his teeth, forcing himself back to his feet, even as the residual energy sizzled across his skin, the faint green glow fading. "You came prepared," he said, his voice a dangerous growl. And the mercenary replied, "We came to bring you in." Henry's laugh was humorless, dark. "You're welcome to try." The carriage exploded into chaos as the battle began, the mercenaries fanning out with military precision, their weapons spitting crackling green bolts that tore holes through the walls and left smoking craters in the floor. Henry moved like lightning, ducking and weaving between the shots, closing the distance to the nearest mercenary and slamming him against the ceiling with bone-rattling force, before tearing the weapon from his hands and crushing it into a sparking mess of metal. Another mercenary swung a glowing baton that crackled with green energy, catching Henry across the jaw and actually making him bleed. Just a thin line, but enough to enrage him. He grabbed the baton mid-swing, snapped it in half, and used the pieces as improvised weapons, hurling them like spears into two more mercenaries and knocking them off their feet. The leader barked orders in a language Henry didn't recognize, and suddenly the entire carriage was lit up with blinding green light as all the mercenaries fired at once, the barrage hitting Henry like a tidal wave. He hit the floor hard, the world spinning for a second as the energy crawled across his veins, weakening him just enough for one of them to rush forward with a pair of glowing restraints. They slammed the cuffs onto his wrists, and for a horrifying instant he felt his strength drain, the glow from his eyes dimming. "Got him," one of them said. But then Henry's head snapped up, his teeth gritted, and with a roar that shook the entire carriage, he ripped the cuffs apart, the fragments clattering across the floor as he surged to his feet with a renewed fury. "I'm done holding back," he shouted, and the temperature in the carriage seemed to rise as his heat vision finally ignited, twin beams of red lancing out and slicing through the weapons of two mercenaries, turning them into molten slag. The remaining mercenaries hesitated, fear creeping in behind their visors, but the leader pressed on, activating something on his suit that caused his entire body to glow with a green aura. "Full charge," he commanded, and the team surged forward as one, a coordinated assault meant to overwhelm even Superman. The carriage became a war zone. Fists slamming into armor, energy blasts scorching the air, Henry's roars mixing with the electronic shouts of the mercenaries. He tore one suit apart with his bare hands, sparks flying as the man inside screamed and was thrown clear. Another he hurled straight through the broken window, the wind howling as the mercenary vanished into the night. The leader was relentless, striking Henry again and again with his glowing gauntlets, each hit sending shockwaves through the metal floor. Henry grabbed him by the chest plate and slammed him through 3 rows of seats, the entire carriage groaning under the impact. "Tell me who sent you," Henry demanded, but the leader only laughed, blood on his teeth behind the visor. "You still don't get it. This isn't about killing you. This is about testing you." And before Henry could react, the leader pressed a command on his wrist console. Instantly, every fallen mercenary suit began to glow, alarms blaring from their power cores. Henry's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. They were turning themselves into bombs. Without hesitation, he ripped the leader's gauntlet off and crushed the console, but it was too late. The first suit detonated, a blinding explosion tearing through half the carriage and ripping open the side of the train, the wind screaming in through the gaping hole. Passengers were sucked towards the opening, the screams lost in the roaring wind, and Henry dove into action, moving faster than the eye could follow as he grabbed 1, 2, 3 people midair and hurled them back to safety before turning and flying straight out through the hole, catching another passenger who had been blown completely clear of the train and carrying them back inside. More suits began to detonate one by one, each explosion tearing more of the train apart, and Henry worked frantically to save as many as he could, moving at the edge of his limits, smoke and fire filling the night behind him. When the last explosion faded, the carriage was barely intact, half its walls gone, the roof peeled open like a tin can, and the mercenary leader was gone, vanished into the night sky, a faint green trail the only sign of his escape. Henry stood amid the wreckage, his chest heaving, his shirt scorched and torn, the wind whipping through his hair as he looked out into the darkness. His jaw clenched. Whoever these people were, they weren't just mercenaries. They were soldiers, and this was no random attack. This was a message, a declaration of open war. But before he could even begin to plan his next move, his super hearing caught something else. The sound of more helicopters, dozens this time, converging on the train from every direction, and from far away a faint, chilling sound of a voice broadcasting over loudspeakers. "Superman, stand down, or everyone on that train dies." The night exploded with sound as the helicopters descended, their rotors chopping through the air like the drums of war, searchlights sweeping across the shattered train as squads of black-armored soldiers rappelled down on ropes, hitting the ground in perfect formation, rifles raised, their glowing barrels tracking Henry's every move. The passengers huddled inside what was left of the carriage, terrified, whispering prayers, their faces lit by the harsh light cutting in from outside. Henry stood in the gaping hole in the train wall, the wind whipping through his hair, his chest rising and falling as he stared down the army converging on them. His hearing picked up their comms, precise, coordinated, professional. This wasn't chaos anymore. This was an operation. Superman! The loudspeaker voice boomed again, cold and metallic, echoing across the valley. You have 10 seconds to surrender, or we take the hostages. Henry's fists clenched at his sides. His entire body was coiled with restrained power, but he knew one wrong move could put every innocent life at risk. You don't want to do this, he called back, his voice carrying over the roar of the helicopters. You've seen what happens when you push me. There was a pause on the comms, then the voice replied, mocking, We want exactly that. Show us what you really are. The soldiers opened fire. The night turned into a storm of tracer fire and plasma bolts as Henry launched himself into the sky, the ground exploding behind him as the first volley missed by inches. He rocketed toward the nearest helicopter, ripping the side door clean off and plucking the gunner out before gently dropping him onto the roof of the train, alive but out of the fight, then spun and smashed the chopper's rotor with a single punch, sending it spiraling safely into a crash landing on the empty tracks behind them. The other helicopters scattered, firing wildly, their guns lighting up the night as Henry zipped between them like a living missile, taking them out one by one with surgical precision, twisting rotors, tearing out weapons, disabling engines, always careful to throw the crews clear before the wrecks hit the ground. Below, the soldiers advanced on the train, their rifles glowing green as they fired in volleys, and Henry dropped from the sky like a meteor, slamming into the dirt with a shockwave that sent half of them flying. Stay away from the civilians, he shouted, grabbing two attackers and slamming them together before tossing them aside. The rest opened fire, surrounding him in a crossfire, but Henry blurred forward, disarming them with lightning-fast strikes, snapping their weapons in half, their formation crumbling under his assault. One soldier managed to tag him with a kryptonite round that burned like fire across his ribs, making him drop to one knee for a moment, but then he tore the glowing fragment out of his suit and hurled it aside, rising again with his eyes burning red. Enough! His heat vision lanced out, cutting a perfect circle around the remaining squad and melting their rifles into slag, leaving them weaponless and stunned. Go home, Henry said, his voice like thunder. Tell whoever sent you that I'm not afraid of them. But then, before the soldiers could even retreat, the ground shook. The sound of something massive approaching filled the night, mechanical, heavy, each footstep like a hammer striking the earth. And from the darkness at the edge of the field came a new enemy, a towering figure encased in hulking power armor, easily twice Henry's size, glowing with the same sickly green energy as the mercenaries' weapons, but far more concentrated, its chest core pulsing like a small star. The soldiers backed away, forming a perimeter, as the armored giant stomped closer, its voice booming through external speakers. Target acquisition complete. Engaging. Henry's jaw tightened as the thing charged, faster than anything that big had any right to be, its fists glowing as it swung at him with bone-crushing force. Henry caught the first blow, the impact kicking up a shockwave that flattened grass and sent soldiers flying. But the second blow connected, hurling Henry back into the side of the train hard enough to dent the steel. Pain flared down his spine as he stood back up, wiping blood from his lip, and for a moment he smiled, not out of amusement, but out of sheer determination. All right, let's see what you got. He shot forward, colliding with the armored behemoth in a clash that lit up the night like lightning, the ground cracking beneath their feet as they traded blows at superhuman speed, each strike sending shockwaves that shattered windows for miles. Henry ducked under a massive swing and drove his fist into the thing's chest plate, denting the armor, but it retaliated with a blast of green energy from its core that sent him flying across the field, his cape trailing fire as he crashed into the dirt. Before he could recover, the giant was on him, pinning him down with one colossal foot, its arm cannon charging with a high-pitched whine. Henry strained against the weight, every muscle burning, his fingers digging furrows into the ground as he forced himself up inch by inch.
Sweat and blood mixed on his face. The cannon reached full charge, glowing so bright it turned the night green. And then, with a roar that shook the earth, Henry shoved the giant's foot off, grabbed its arm, and wrenched it upward just as it fired, the blast shooting harmlessly into the sky like a green comet. Using the opening, he spun the monster around and hurled it across the field, the ground shaking as it skidded and tore up dirt. The soldiers looked on in stunned silence, their weapons forgotten, as Henry slowly stalked toward the fallen giant, eyes blazing. But just as he closed in, the giant slammed both fists into the ground, triggering some kind of seismic charge that detonated under Henry's feet, blasting him straight into the air. And as he tumbled through the sky, dazed, he saw something that made his heart stop. The train, with all the passengers still inside, was beginning to move again, rolling backwards down the track, completely out of control, its brakes blown by the earlier explosions. Henry twisted in midair, trying to regain control, but the giant was already getting back to its feet, energy building in its core again for another devastating attack. He had seconds to choose: finish the fight or save the train.
Henry didn't hesitate. The second he saw the train picking up speed on the downhill track, his entire body became a blur of motion, launching skyward in a streak of red and blue, the wind screaming in his ears as he rocketed after the runaway cars, leaving the armored giant roaring in frustration behind him. The glowing monster fired another energy blast, a beam of sickly green that tore across the field and barely missed Henry's back as he accelerated, the heat from it washing over him as he gritted his teeth and pushed harder, faster, until the train was right beneath him, sparks flying from its damaged wheels as it barreled down the track like a bullet from a gun. Through the shattered roof he saw terrified faces, passengers clinging to anything they could hold on to, luggage tumbling, glass breaking, screams filling the night. Henry swooped down, landing hard on the roof of the lead car, the metal groaning under his weight as he dropped into a crouch and slammed his hands against the front coupling. Muscles bulged, veins stood out along his arms as he dug in, boots scraping across the roof as he put all his strength into stopping the train. The rails screamed in protest, sparks showering into the night as the train fought him, the sheer momentum threatening to rip him off the roof. He gritted his teeth, digging deeper, feeling every ounce of power in his Kryptonian frame burn as he held the engine back, the metal under his hands glowing red from the friction, the ground vibrating beneath him. "Come on," he growled through clenched teeth, the wind tearing at his cape as the train slowly, painfully began to lose speed. But before he could bring it to a full stop, the armored giant struck again. It had leapt onto the tracks behind the train, running at impossible speed, its massive fists pounding the ground like war drums as it closed the distance. Henry felt the vibrations coming up through the train before he even turned his head, and when he did, he saw the monster charging straight at them, its core glowing brighter with every step. "Not now," Henry muttered, forcing the train to a near stop before leaping straight off the roof and hitting the ground running, meeting the giant head-on in a clash that sent shockwaves down the tracks. The two titans slammed into each other with earth-shattering force, the rails buckling under their feet as Henry tackled the giant away from the train, sending them both tumbling through the dirt in a tangle of fists, metal, and fury. The train was still rolling slowly downhill, but now it was safe enough for the passengers to recover. Henry could hear their relieved cries as he focused back on the fight. The giant swung a massive haymaker, catching Henry across the jaw and sending him skidding through a line of railroad signal posts that shattered like matchsticks. But he rolled with the momentum, flipping back to his feet and blasting forward again with a flying punch that caved in part of the giant's chest plate, exposing glowing wires and sparking circuits. The thing bellowed in electronic rage and grabbed Henry in both arms, trying to crush him, the green glow searing his skin as he strained against its grip. Pain lanced through his ribs, every nerve screaming, but then Henry's eyes flared, and with a roar he unleashed twin beams of heat vision straight into the exposed wiring, the smell of molten metal filling the night as the giant howled and dropped him. Henry didn't waste a second. He dove under the giant's guard, grabbed it by the waist and hurled it clean off the track, sending it crashing into a
nearby maintenance yard. The impact lit up the night with sparks and smoke, but Henry knew it wasn't over. He could still hear its power core humming, rebooting, winding up for another attack. He shot back to the train, flying along its length to make sure every car was stable, using bursts of speed to reattach loose couplings and straighten twisted wheels. Finally, he landed in front of the engine again, braced himself, and shoved one last time until the entire train screeched to a stop, the rails glowing orange from the heat. Henry staggered back, breathing hard, his shirt torn, his knuckles bloody, but when he heard the cheers from the passengers behind him, it fueled him like nothing else. "You're safe now," he called out, his voice carrying over the wreckage, but then his super hearing caught it, the faint, high-pitched whine of something charging. He spun just in time to see the armored giant leap out of the smoking crater, its entire body glowing with energy now, its chest core pulsing faster, hotter, until Henry realized what it was doing. It was going to overload itself, turning into a living bomb big enough to level everything within a mile. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Henry shot forward, slamming into the giant at full speed and carrying it into the air, the ground below vanishing in a blur as they shot skyward, higher and higher until the train and the tracks were tiny specks below. "If you want to blow, you're doing it up here," Henry shouted, straining against the giant's limbs as they climbed higher into the stratosphere, frost forming on his cape as the air grew thin. The giant's core was seconds from detonation now, its voice blaring a mechanical countdown that echoed in Henry's ears. 3, 2, and with one last surge of strength, Henry hurled it as far as he could into the upper atmosphere. The explosion lit up the sky like a second sun, a silent, blinding bloom of green fire that sent a shockwave rippling through the clouds, shaking the very stars. Henry was hurled backward by the blast, tumbling end over end before catching himself and diving back toward the earth, the wind howling around him as he plummeted back to the train site. He landed hard, sending up a crater of dust, his chest heaving, his body smoking from the heat, but before he could even catch his breath, he heard it, slow, mocking applause coming from somewhere in the shadows. From the far edge of the tracks, a new figure stepped into the light, a man in a perfectly tailored white suit, flanked by more soldiers, his face calm, almost amused. "Bravo," he said, his voice smooth and rich with menace. "You're really everything they say you are, which makes what comes next so much more interesting."
The man in white walked slowly toward the stopped train, each footstep deliberate, his polished shoes untouched by the dirt and chaos around them, as if he existed above it all. His soldiers fanned out behind him in perfect silence, forming a semicircle around Henry, their weapons lowered but ready, eyes hidden behind black visors. Henry stood in the middle of the tracks, cape torn and fluttering in the wind, shoulders rising and falling with every controlled breath, his body still humming with residual energy from the explosion above. "You set all this up," Henry said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. The man smiled, slow and cold. "Of course I did. Do you think accidents just happen to you, Superman? No. I wanted to see what you would do. I wanted to see if the legend matched the man." He gestured casually to the smoking wreckage of the armored giant behind them. "You passed the first test." Henry's fists clenched at his sides. "Test? People could have died. Innocent people." The man's smile widened. "And yet they didn't. Which means you are exactly what I hoped you'd be. Predictable." Henry took a step forward, the air crackling faintly around him, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head, studying Henry like a scientist studying a specimen. "You think this was random?" the man continued, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "No, this was a data collection exercise. Every movement you made tonight, every choice, every microsecond of hesitation was recorded, analyzed, and fed into a system I've been building for years. You've just given me everything I need to build the perfect countermeasure to you." Henry's eyes narrowed, heat vision threatening to flare but held in check. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man gave a little bow. "Call me whatever you like. The media will, eventually. But for tonight, you may call me Lorenzo." Henry's jaw tightened at the name. Lorenzo, the whispers in the underworld, the man behind half the black market weapons in Europe, the ghost who never left fingerprints. Henry had heard of him, but never seen a face. Now here he was, smiling like they were meeting at a gala instead of standing in a war zone. "You've endangered a lot of lives tonight, Lorenzo," Henry said, taking another step forward, his boots grinding against the rail. "You're done." Lorenzo chuckled softly and snapped his fingers. In an instant, several of the soldiers raised strange-looking rifles, not the glowing green ones from before, but sleeker, deadlier, humming with an energy Henry didn't recognize. Ah, Lorenzo said, wagging a finger. "You know I like to be dramatic, Superman, but I also like to be prepared. You think I would face you without insurance?" Henry's superhearing picked up something high-pitched, a pulsing whine coming from the rifles, the frequency just sharp enough to hurt. He grimaced, feeling a wave of nausea roll through him. "Red solar energy," Lorenzo said, almost cheerfully. "You didn't think we'd only bring kryptonite to the party, did you? We've been learning from you for a long time." The soldiers took a step closer, the rifle's glow intensifying, and Henry felt his strength flicker, the world suddenly heavier around him. His knees bent slightly, sweat breaking out on his forehead. Lorenzo watched with fascination. "Beautiful," he murmured. "Even a god can be made to kneel." Henry straightened, forcing himself to stand tall despite the weakness creeping into his limbs. "I'm not here for your games," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "You're going to walk away, and you're going to let these people go." Lorenzo laughed, a rich, genuine sound. "You think you're still in control? That's adorable." He snapped his fingers again, and two of the soldiers dragged something forward. A man, bound and gagged, bloodied but alive, his eyes wide with fear. "Recognize him?" Lorenzo asked. Henry's stomach dropped. It was the train conductor, the man who had risked his life trying to warn the passengers before everything went to hell. "He's not part of this," Henry growled, taking a step forward, but Lorenzo simply raised his hand. "He is now. You see, Superman, this is the real test. You've proven you can save a train. You've proven you can survive a machine built to kill you. But can you save just one man when doing so will cost you everything?" He nodded to the soldiers, who dragged the conductor toward the edge of the tracks, where the drop was steep and lined with jagged rocks below. One wrong move, and he'd be gone. Henry's pulse roared in his ears. He could hear the man's heartbeat, fast and panicked, could smell the blood and fear. His body ached to move, to close the distance, but every step he took forward made the soldiers raise their rifles higher, the red energy burning through him like acid. Lorenzo stepped closer until they were almost face to face, his calm, cold eyes meeting Henry's blazing ones. "You have 10 seconds, he said softly, almost gently. "Fight me now, and I kill him. Stand down, and I let him live. But you come with me." Henry's mind raced, every calculation happening in a blur. He could disarm 2, maybe 3 rifles before they fired, but not all. And if even one shot hit the conductor, he was gone. He looked back at the passengers in the train, their terrified faces watching through the shattered windows, waiting for their hero to act. Henry's jaw clenched, his heart pounding like a war drum as he weighed the impossible choice. Finally, he dropped his fists to his sides. "Let him go," he said, his voice like iron. Lorenzo smiled, slowly, triumph glinting in his eyes. "Good," he said, snapping his fingers. The soldiers released the conductor, who stumbled backward, collapsing onto the ground, sobbing in relief.
Henry exhaled, just a fraction, and in that split second, Lorenzo struck. The soldiers fired, beams of red light converging on Henry from every direction, his body convulsing with pain as the energy drained what little strength he had left. He dropped to one knee, struggling to stay conscious as Lorenzo stepped closer, crouching in front of him. "You see," he said softly, almost kindly, "predictable." With a gesture, he ordered the soldiers to move in. Two of them grabbed Henry by the arms, forcing him to his feet as Lorenzo straightened his jacket. "Take him," Lorenzo ordered. "We have so much more to show our friend." Henry tried to resist, his boots dragging furrows in the dirt, but his power was gone, his body sluggish and heavy. The last thing he saw before they hauled him away was the conductor, safe but staring in horror, and the passengers pressing against the windows, powerless to help, their hero being dragged into the shadows. And as the night swallowed him, Henry made himself a silent promise. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot.
Henry woke to darkness, his body aching as though he'd been dragged through a war, which, in a way, he had. The first thing he felt was the cold bite of metal against his wrists and ankles. Restraints forged from some alien alloy, humming with faint energy that kept his muscles weak and his powers muted. His head throbbed as he tried to move, but the moment he strained against the bonds, a surge of red light flared through the cuffs, searing his skin and forcing him back against the cold steel chair bolted to the floor. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm, to center his thoughts. This wasn't the first time he'd been captured, but something about the silence in the room felt different, deliberate. When his vision adjusted, he saw he was in a large, dimly lit chamber, walls of black reinforced steel, a faint glow from panels overhead casting long shadows. And then a voice came, smooth and amused, echoing through hidden speakers. "You recover quickly. Impressive. Lorenzo." Henry's jaw tightened. "Where am I?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "A safe place," Lorenzo replied lightly. "Safe for me, that is. For you, well, that depends on how long it takes for you to break." The lights brightened slightly, revealing that the chamber was ringed with high-tech cameras and strange devices aimed directly at him, some scanning his vitals, others glowing with energy Henry didn't recognize. "What do you want?" Henry asked. "I already told you," Lorenzo said, stepping into the light now, perfectly composed in his white suit as if this was just a business meeting. "Data. Understanding. The chance to prove that even you have limits." He walked slowly around Henry, inspecting him like a prized fighter before a match. "You've been put on a pedestal your whole life, Superman. The unbreakable man. The unstoppable force. I intend to find out what happens when we stop you." Henry's eyes narrowed. "You won't win." Lorenzo chuckled. "You're already here, aren't you? Stripped of power, caged like an animal. But let's not rush. We have time." He gestured toward the wall, and a section slid open to reveal a transparent panel, a window into another room where Henry saw dozens of hostages, the same passengers from the train now being tended to by Lorenzo's men. "They're safe," Lorenzo said with a shrug, "for now. But their safety depends on your cooperation." Henry's heart clenched. "If you touch them—" "Oh, we won't," Lorenzo interrupted smoothly, "unless you give me a reason to. That's the beauty of leverage." He leaned closer, his smile sharp. "Every time you resist me, every time you disobey, I make their situation slightly worse. Not enough to kill them, just enough to hurt. And you will know, Superman. You will hear their screams, and you will decide how much pain they endure." Henry's jaw tightened, anger flaring in his chest, but he forced himself to stay still. Giving in to rage would only feed Lorenzo's game. "You can't break me," he said, his voice steady. Maybe not, but we'll see. He turned and walked away, the door hissing shut behind him, leaving Henry alone in the humming chamber. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, Henry couldn't tell. There were no clocks, no sounds except his own breathing. Then came the first test. The lights flickered, and the room's gravity suddenly tripled, slamming Henry down into the chair with crushing force. Pain shot through his bones as he fought to breathe, his muscles straining against the weight. His restraints glowed, pumping red solar energy into his body, draining what little strength he had left. The speakers crackled to life. "Still with us?" Lorenzo's voice was almost cheerful. "Good. Let's see how long that lasts." The gravity increased again, forcing Henry's head down, blood pounding in his ears. Sweat poured down his face, but he gritted his teeth and endured, refusing to give Lorenzo the satisfaction of hearing him scream. Images began to play on the walls, holograms of destruction, of cities burning, of people crying out for Superman who never came. "You can't save them all," Lorenzo's voice whispered, "and every second you waste here, someone else suffers." The gravity pressed harder. Henry's vision blurred, his breath came in short, ragged gasps. His body screamed at him to give in. But deep inside, a different voice spoke. His father's voice. "You are stronger than this, son. You are meant to inspire, not to yield." With a roar that shook the chamber, Henry pushed against the restraints, muscles bulging, the chair groaning under the strain. Sparks flew as cracks formed in the cuffs, the red energy sputtering. Lorenzo's voice snapped through the speakers, sharp now. "Impressive, but let's see how you do with this." Panels in the walls slid open, releasing drones into the chamber, sleek machines bristling with weapons. They opened fire, stun rounds, and energy beams hammering into Henry from all sides. Each hit felt like fire across his skin, but he didn't stop. One cuff snapped, then the other, until finally, with a final roar, he ripped the chair free from the floor and hurled it into the nearest drone, shattering it into a spray of metal. Sparks and smoke filled the chamber as Henry tore the remaining restraints off, standing tall despite the gravity still trying to crush him. The drones swarmed, but he moved faster now, his strength beginning to return as his body metabolized the last of the red solar energy. He grabbed two drones mid-air and smashed them together, ducked a blast from another and hurled it into the wall so hard it embedded there. When the last drone fell, sparking to the floor, Henry stood in the center of the room, chest heaving, eyes blazing. "I told you," he growled, staring straight into one of the cameras. "You can't break me." For a moment there was silence. Then Lorenzo's laughter echoed through the speakers, low and impressed. "Oh, Superman," he said almost admiringly. "I wasn't trying to break you. I was trying to wake you up. Now, the real game begins." The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness, and when they came back on, Henry found he was no longer in the chamber at all, but standing in the center of what looked like a massive underground arena, surrounded by tiers of armored soldiers and weapons pointed at him, the ceiling high above glittering with lights like stars. And then across from him, stepping out of the shadows, was another figure. A second armored giant, bigger and more advanced than the one he'd fought before, its core pulsing brighter, its claws gleaming. Lorenzo's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, full of malicious delight. "Round 2. The arena lights blazed to life all at once, bathing Henry in a stark white glow, throwing his shadow long across the cracked concrete floor. The air was thick with tension, the sound of hundreds of soldiers lining the perimeter like silent statues, their rifles glinting under the lights. From a high balcony at the far end, Lorenzo stood with a glass of wine in hand, smiling like a man watching his favorite sport. "Welcome to my Colosseum," he called down, his voice amplified so it echoed through the cavernous space. "I built this place to test weapons, but tonight it tests you." The armored giant stepped fully into view now, a towering monstrosity of steel and energy, its design sleeker, more menacing, with its glowing core beating like a malignant heart. It was flanked by smaller drones, a swarm of them, their red optics all locking onto Henry. The restraints were gone, the red solar energy gone. His power was flooding back now, every heartbeat stronger than the last, every breath pulling in air like fire in his lungs. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, and looked straight at the monster across the arena. "If this is the best you've got," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "you should have brought two." The arena erupted into chaos as the giant charged, its footsteps thundering like cannon fire, claws gouging deep furrows in the ground as it swung. Henry met it head-on, their collision detonating like a bomb, sending shockwaves through the arena that knocked soldiers off their feet. Henry ducked under the giant's next swing, driving his fist into its midsection with such force the armor buckled inward, sparks exploding outward, but the machine barely slowed. Its claws raked across his chest, tearing his suit, drawing blood, but Henry gritted his teeth and pressed forward, slamming shoulder first into the thing and shoving it back. The drone swooped in, firing synchronized volleys of energy blasts that turned the air into a storm of fire and light. Henry blurred into motion, faster than human eyes could follow, weaving between the beams, smashing drones out of the sky with pinpoint punches, grabbing two at once and hurling them into the giant's chest, creating a chain reaction of explosions that staggered it. Soldiers opened fire from the perimeter now, adding their weapons to the barrage, but Henry spun midair, letting his heat vision sweep across their firing line like twin beams of red lightning, melting their weapons into slag without harming a single man. "Stand down!" he roared, his voice echoing through the chamber, and for a heartbeat they hesitated, fear rippling through their ranks. But Lorenzo's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Don't stop! Bring him down!" The soldiers obeyed, unleashing another wave of fire, forcing Henry back toward the center as the giant recovered, its core now glowing dangerously bright. It unleashed a beam of green energy straight at him, the blast so powerful it carved a molten trench across the arena floor. Henry crossed his arms and braced, the beam slamming into him like a freight train, his boots skidding backward, the heat searing his skin, but he held, step by step, pushing against it, until he was close enough to grab the emitter on the giant's chest and rip it free, tearing the glowing core straight out of its housing. The giant convulsed, its systems sparking wildly, and Henry hurled the core straight up into the ceiling, where it detonated harmlessly in a bloom of green light. The blast left the arena momentarily in silence, smoke curling around Henry as he stood over the staggering machine. With a roar, he leapt onto its back, ripped open the armor plating, and drove his fists into its core systems until the entire thing collapsed to its knees and then fell face first to the ground, sparks dying as it lay still. The soldiers hesitated now, the sight of their ultimate weapon lying broken in front of them enough to freeze them in place. Henry turned slowly, cape torn and hanging in tatters, blood streaked across his face, but his eyes were blazing with unstoppable fire. "This ends now," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the arena. For a moment, there was silence. Then Lorenzo clapped slowly from his balcony, the sound mocking, infuriating. "Magnificent! Truly magnificent! You've proven everything I wanted to know. You've shown me where your limits are and how to surpass them." He raised a small device in his hand, pressing a button, and the entire arena floor rumbled. Panels slid open around the perimeter, revealing a ring of massive energy cannons, their barrels glowing as they powered up. "But I can't have you leaving here alive, so this is where your story ends." The cannons charged, the glow growing blindingly bright as Henry stood alone in the center of the arena, chest heaving, every muscle ready for the fight of his life. He glanced around at the soldiers, at the terrified hostages watching from behind protective glass high above, and Lorenzo smirking down at him like a god passing judgment. And then Henry straightened, lifting his chin, squaring his shoulders, and planting his boots. "You have to do better than that," he said. The cannons fired all at once, a ring of death converging on him in a wall of unstoppable energy, and Henry launched himself straight up into the heart of the barrage, a blur of motion as the entire arena exploded into blinding light. For a long, terrible moment, there was only light and silence. The arena swallowed by a blinding storm of energy, the shockwave rattling the walls, shattering consoles, and sending soldiers sprawling. Lorenzo shielded his eyes from the balcony, his smile finally slipping as the blast died down and the smoke began to clear. The floor of the arena was scorched black, debris scattered everywhere, chunks of the destroyed cannon still glowing hot. But at the center of the devastation, a figure stood. Henry's silhouette emerged from the haze like something out of legend, cape torn to ribbons, suit charred, body streaked with soot and blood, but standing tall, unbroken, his eyes blazing with that unmistakable Kryptonian fire. Gasps rippled through the soldiers as Henry slowly raised his head, the smoke swirling around him like a storm. He took a step forward, then another, and with each step the sound of his boots echoed like thunder in the suddenly silent arena. Lorenzo's wineglass slipped from his fingers and shattered at his feet. "Impossible," he whispered. Henry's voice cut through the air like a blade. "I told you, this ends now." In a flash, he launched himself upward, smashing through the balcony railing and landing in front of Lorenzo before the man could even reach for the device on his belt. Lorenzo's guards moved to intercept, but Henry was faster. He grabbed two by their vests, flung them aside with effortless force, crushed the control device in Lorenzo's hand before he could trigger anything, and pinned him against the wall. The soldiers below aimed their weapons, but Henry's glare alone was enough to freeze them in place. "Call them off," Henry growled. Lorenzo smirked despite himself, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "If I do, you'll just hand me over to the authorities," he said. "And you know what will happen. I'll be out in a week. You can't stop me forever." Henry's jaw tightened as he stared into the man's cold, calculating eyes. "Maybe not," Henry said, his voice like iron. "But tonight, you don't win." He released Lorenzo just long enough to drag him by the collar to the edge of the balcony, holding him there as his cape fluttered in the hot wind rising from the shattered arena. "Look," Henry said, gesturing to the floor below. Lorenzo followed his gaze. His soldiers had lowered their weapons, some even helping the wounded among their ranks, no longer willing to fight. The hostages were safe, freed from their cells as Henry had disabled the locks with a blast of heat vision the moment he landed. "You built this place to prove I could be broken," Henry said, voice steady but hard. "But what you've really done is shown them what happens when you cross the line." He turned and hurled Lorenzo to the ground, not enough to kill, but enough to leave him groaning and humiliated, stripped of the power he had wielded so smugly. Henry floated up into the air, hovering over the arena floor like an avenging spirit. "This ends tonight," Henry shouted, his voice reverberating through the chamber. The soldiers backed away, laying down their weapons one by one, and soon the arena was silent except for the hum of emergency generators. Henry landed among them, standing as tall as ever despite the damage to his body, and one by one, the mercenaries knelt, not out of fear, but out of respect for the man who had just fought through hell to save them all. When the authorities finally stormed the compound minutes later, they found Lorenzo waiting in handcuffs, the soldiers surrendering without a fight, and Henry standing in the wreckage, watching over the freed hostages as they embraced one another, crying with relief. As dawn broke outside, painting the horizon with gold and crimson, Henry stepped out into the light, his cape still tattered, but catching the morning wind. The world seemed to hold its breath. He could still feel the pain in his ribs, the ache in his muscles, the weight of what he had endured. But more than that, he felt the quiet, unshakable certainty that he had done what was right. Lorenzo had wanted to show the world that even Superman could be broken. Instead, the world had seen something else, that Superman could be beaten, bloodied, brought to his knees, and still get back up. As the sun climbed higher, Henry took to the skies, soaring above the ruined compound, the morning air cool against his face. He thought of the passengers safe now, returning to their families. He thought of the soldiers, who had seen what true strength looked like, not just power, but compassion. And he thought of Lorenzo, who even now was plotting his next move somewhere behind prison bars. There would always be another fight, another night like this one. But that was the choice he had made, long ago, to stand between the world and the darkness, no matter the cost. As he climbed higher, breaking through the clouds into the pure light above, Henry allowed himself a rare smile. "Let them come," he whispered to the sky. "I'm ready." And with that, he became a streak of red and blue against the rising sun, racing toward whatever waited next, not as a god, not as an unbreakable myth, but as the man who refused to give up, no matter how many times the world tried to break him.